Convicted of the murder of Officer William Toney, Benjamin Donnie Ritchie now waits on death row, his final chapter drawing near. On October 15th, 2002, he was sentenced to die for the fatal shooting of a young police officer who was simply doing his job, trying to return home to his wife and daughters. Every legal avenue has been explored, every appeal denied. Now the state of Indiana has set Ritchie's execution date for May 20th, 2025. His case has since drawn national attention, featured in true crime documentaries that continue to stir both scrutiny and debate. But beyond the headlines lies a story that stretches back decades, a life shaped by tragedy, steeped in violence and barreling toward an irreversible end. Benjamin Ritchie was born on May 30th, 1980, under the shadow of hardship. His biological father was never identified, and his mother struggled with addiction throughout her pregnancy, setting the tone for the chaos that would follow. Before he was even 3 years old, she abandoned him, leaving him to navigate a confusing and unstable world. The man she later married walked away too, disappearing after learning Ritchie wasn't his biological son. Though eventually adopted and given a new name, Ritchie found no refuge. School brought more struggle than stability, as behavioral issues and emotional turmoil dominated his youth. Counseling offered temporary support, and a series of diagnoses, including bipolar disorder and cognitive impairments, provided some answers, but no lasting peace. By 1998, Ritchie was convicted of burglary and placed on probation. It was his first formal step into the criminal justice system, a step that would soon become a free-fall. Everything changed on the night of September 29th, 2000. Alongside accomplices, Ritchie stole a van from a gas station, setting off a chain of events that would end in irreversible loss. Officer Matthew Hickey spotted the stolen vehicle and initiated a pursuit. Officer William Toney joined in, unaware that this call would be his last. When the van finally stopped, the suspects scattered. Ritchie, desperate and armed, ran. But then, just moments later, he turned and fired 4 times. One of these bullets struck Officer Toney in the chest, slipping above his protective vest. In a flash, his life was gone, taken in the line of duty. Officer Toney was more than a uniform. He was a husband, a father, a son, a respected protector of his community. His death left a permanent scar on those who loved him. Ritchie was arrested the very next day at a friend's home. His attempt to escape justice brought to a swift end. He was charged with a series of crimes, including the most serious of all, the murder of a police officer. The road to justice had begun, and it would lead unflinchingly to death row. The trial of Benjamin Donnie Ritchie was among the most emotionally charged and closely watched in Indiana's recent history. With the weight of a fallen officer and a grieving family behind them, prosecutors sought the ultimate punishment: death. A gag order was issued early in the proceedings to prevent public commentary from influencing the jury pool, keeping the details of the case sealed behind courtroom walls. Ritchie's co-defendants faced lesser consequences. Michael Greer, one of the accomplices, accepted a plea deal and testified against Ritchie in exchange for leniency. While Michael Moody was convicted on auto theft charges, his role in the stolen van overshadowed by the gravity of Officer Toney's murder. Ritchie's defense team fought to spare his life, citing the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in Ring v. Arizona in an attempt to challenge the constitutionality of Indiana's death penalty statute. But their argument fell short. The judge upheld the state's laws, allowing the case to proceed. Jury selection began under intense scrutiny, each member carrying the weight of determining not just guilt, but whether a man would live or die. On August 10th, 2002, the jury delivered its verdict: guilty of murder. The defense made one final plea for mercy, urging the court to consider Ritchie's traumatic childhood, his mental health struggles, and the long chain of failures that shaped his path. But 4 days later, the jury recommended the death penalty. It was a decision that would mark Ritchie's fate forever. On October 15th, 2002, Judge Patricia Gifford formally sentenced Ritchie to death. The courtroom fell silent as Officer William Toney's widow rose to deliver her victim impact statement. Through tears, her voice carried the weight of 2 fatherless daughters and a shattered future. Her words painted a vivid picture of enduring loss and the permanent void left behind. A reminder that justice, no matter how swift, could never restore what had been taken. Ritchie was transferred to Indiana State Prison, where he became one of many waiting on death row. His life now measured in appeals and legal motions. Inside the stark confines of prison, something unexpected unfolded. In the most unlikely of places, Ritchie began a correspondence with a woman from Sweden who had seen his story featured in a documentary. Their letters grew into a connection that defied walls and distance. She visited him in person, crossing continents for brief moments of human contact amid the isolation. Still, the legal machine continued its course. In 2004, the Indiana Supreme Court rejected Ritchie's direct appeal, affirming both the conviction and the sentence. A second appeal followed in 2007, raising claims of ineffective legal counsel. That, too, was denied. In 2017, the U.S. Supreme Court dismissed Ritchie's final appeal, closing the last legal door available to him. With no further recourse, the Indiana Attorney General filed a motion to set an execution date, and the court responded. May 20th, 2025 was chosen as the day the sentence would be carried out. As the date approached, arguments again surfaced around Ritchie's mental health and legal representation, but none gained traction. They were the desperate final attempts to delay the inevitable. Throughout it all, Officer Toney's widow remained a resolute voice, standing firm in her belief that justice must be done. For her, the execution represented more than punishment. It was closure, a long-awaited reckoning for the man who took away her husband, her daughter's father, and a piece of her heart she would never get back. The execution of Joseph Corcoran marked the end of Indiana's long-standing moratorium on capital punishment, clearing the path for the state's next scheduled execution, that of Benjamin Donnie Ritchie. With legal avenues nearly exhausted, Ritchie's final motion for post-conviction relief was rejected by the Indiana Supreme Court, removing the last remaining barrier between him and his sentence. Though a dissenting opinion raised concerns about Ritchie's mental health and the quality of his legal defense, the majority decision stood firm. The date was officially set, May 20th, 2025. Barring a last-minute intervention, Ritchie would face the ultimate punishment for the life he took nearly 25 years earlier. The memory of Officer William Toney remained vivid within the Beech Grove community. His funeral drew hundreds in a show of unity, love, and respect for a man who had died doing what he was sworn to do: serve and protect. Fellow officers involved in the case were publicly commended for their diligence and professionalism throughout the investigation and trial. In the wake of tragedy, the community rallied around Officer Toney's family. Fundraising efforts were launched to support his 2 young daughters, helping secure their future in the absence of their father. His widow, though devastated by the loss, eventually remarried, finding comfort and companionship after years of sorrow. Yet she never wavered in her stance on justice. She remained an unwavering voice in support of capital punishment, believing it to be a necessary measure to uphold accountability and deliver closure for families like hers. In the years following the trial, Ritchie's case continued to draw attention. It was prominently featured in Inside Death Row, a documentary series that brought new eyes to the legal, moral and emotional complexities surrounding his conviction. Public opinion remained sharply divided. Some questioned the role of mental illness in the crime, while others pointed to the calculated nature of Ritchie's actions that night. The tragic chain of events had started with a seemingly impulsive crime: a stolen van from a gas station in Beech Grove. Ritchie, along with 2 accomplices, triggered a manhunt that would escalate rapidly. Police responded to the report and soon spotted the stolen vehicle. After a brief chase, the van came to a stop in a residential yard. Ritchie and another individual bolted from the scene, attempting to flee on foot. Officer Toney pursued Ritchie, unaware he was closing in on a man armed and desperate. Without warning, Ritchie turned and fired 4 rounds. 1 bullet struck Officer Toney fatally, ending his life on the spot. The state's case was anchored by 2 aggravating factors. Ritchie was already on probation for a 1998 burglary conviction, and Officer Toney had been performing his official duties at the time of his death. The prosecution argued these facts justified the death penalty, and in 2002, the jury agreed. Ritchie was convicted of murder, along with several additional offenses, and sentenced to death, a verdict the trial court upheld without hesitation. Ritchie's legal battle stretched on for over a decade. He challenged his conviction and sentence in multiple state and federal courts, raising claims ranging from constitutional violations to ineffective legal representation. But one by one, his appeals were denied. In 2004, the Indiana Supreme Court upheld his sentence, and in 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case. He pursued post-conviction relief in Marion Superior Court, which partially denied his request. When he appealed that decision, the Indiana Supreme Court determined that Ritchie had waived several of his claims and ruled against him on the remaining issues. Refusing to give up, Ritchie initiated federal habeas corpus review in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Indiana. That, too, was denied, including his request for a certificate of appealability. He appealed to the 7th Circuit Court, but again his petition was rejected. His final request for a rehearing was denied as well, closing the door on any further legal options. The U.S. Supreme Court's denial of certiorari in April 2017 marked the end of his federal appeals and cemented his fate. Now, with all legal avenues closed, Benjamin Donnie Ritchie waits on death row as the clock runs out. His life, defined by abandonment, crime, and ultimately violence, is nearing its last page. Officer William Toney's memory lives on, not only in the hearts of his loved ones, but in the community he served. Each year, an annual cornhole tournament is held in his name, a celebration of his life and sacrifice. As May 20th, 2025 approaches, it stands not just as an execution date, but as the closing act in a long, painful chapter of Indiana's criminal justice history.
A double bacon cheeseburger, deep dish apple pie, and vanilla bean ice cream. If all goes as scheduled tomorrow, that's what death row inmate Oscar Smith will eat as his final meal before the state executes him.
Oscar Franklin Smith was convicted of capital murder in Tennessee and sentenced to death for a crime that shook the community to its core. His execution was originally scheduled for April 21st, 2022, but just days before the date, Tennessee Governor Bill Lee issued a temporary reprieve due to complications with the state's lethal injection procedures. Now Smith remains on death row at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, with a new execution date set by the Tennessee Supreme Court for May 22nd, 2025. But behind the dates and legal filings lies a case as disturbing as it is complex, one that continues to stir questions and emotions more than 3 decades later. The murders that led to Smith's conviction occurred late on the night of Sunday, October 1st, 1989. At approximately 11:20 p.m., Nashville's emergency dispatchers received a chilling 911 call from a home on Ludi Street in the Woodbine neighborhood. The call, later enhanced and played at trial, captured the desperate voices of two teenage boys in distress. One voice, later identified as 13-year-old Jason Burnett, can be heard crying out, "Help me," while his older brother, 16-year-old Chad Burnett, screams, "Frank, no, God help me." The line suddenly went silent. Only a partial address was spoken before the call ended. Police officers responded quickly, arriving at the house just 5 minutes later. They knocked, received no response, and found the property quiet. Believing it was a false alarm, they left. What they didn't know was that behind that door, a tragedy had already unfolded. It wasn't until 3 p.m. the following day that the horrifying truth came to light. Inside the home, investigators found the lifeless bodies of Judith Smith and her 2 sons. The scene was both chaotic and heartbreaking. Chad was found lying on his back in the kitchen. The room was in disarray, the phone torn from the wall, and blood staining nearly every surface. Near his body was a tool often used in leather working, something like an awl or ice pick. Chad had been shot 3 times, in the shoulder, chest, and forehead, with 2 of those wounds fired at close range. In addition to the gunshots, he had suffered numerous stab wounds to his chest, back, and stomach. His throat had been cut, and his hands bore signs of a desperate struggle. Judith, 35, was discovered on her bed in the front bedroom. Blood spattered the paneled wall beside her. She had been shot in the arm and the neck, the latter wound delivered from close range, severing her spinal cord. Medical experts testified that this gunshot rendered her immediately paralyzed and unconscious, causing her death soon after. Disturbingly, her body showed signs of post-mortem injuries. Her neck had been slashed, and she had been stabbed repeatedly with both a knife and a sharp needle-like weapon, similar to the one found near Chad. The most tragic discovery, however, may have been young Jason. His small body lay at the foot of his mother's bed. Unlike his brother and mother, Jason had not been shot, but he had endured numerous stab wounds to his chest and abdomen. 2 of those wounds severed major blood vessels, causing him to slowly bleed to death over the course of several painful minutes. His neck had also been slashed, and his hands were marked by defensive wounds, evidence of a desperate attempt to protect himself. The medical examiner confirmed that all 3 victims had been killed approximately 12 hours before their bodies were discovered. There were no signs of forced entry. No valuables appeared to be stolen. The attack was targeted, deliberate, and deeply personal. The brutality of the scene stunned investigators and horrified the local community. As detectives dug deeper, they began to piece together a troubling picture of Judith's recent past and the growing tensions between her and her estranged husband, Oscar Franklin Smith. There were no signs of forced entry into the home that night. The back door stood ajar, and inside, it was clear that something violent had occurred. The kitchen bore the brunt of the struggle. A table had been broken, one of its legs snapped off, during what must have been a desperate fight for survival. In the den, investigators found a .22 caliber cartridge on the rug. Forensic testing later confirmed that bullets removed from the bodies of Judith Smith and her son Chad matched this exact caliber and came from the same firearm. Bullet holes marked the walls of both the den and the front bedroom, and a trail of blood led from the den down the hallway to the kitchen, mapping out the path of chaos. Drops of blood were even discovered in the bathroom sink, suggesting that someone had attempted to clean up before fleeing the scene.
Still, all the evidence tying Oscar Franklin Smith to the murders of his estranged wife and her sons remained circumstantial. The question that haunted investigators, the courtroom, and the community was simple, yet deeply troubling. Why would he do this? To understand that, we must look back at the tangled and turbulent history between Oscar known to some as Frank, and Judith. The couple had married on August 8, 1985, but this wasn't Frank's first marriage. He had 2 children from a previous relationship, Laura, then 18, and Merle, 15, both of whom lived with Frank's parents in Pleasant View, Tennessee. Judith also had 2 sons from a prior relationship, Chad and Jason. In December 1986, Frank and Judith welcomed twin boys, Chris and Casey. But by June 1989, their marriage had fallen apart, and the two formally separated. A divorce was in progress at the time of the murders. Judith had been awarded temporary custody of the twins, while Frank was allowed visitation every other weekend. Custody of the twins was a central issue in the divorce proceedings, and a source of growing tension. By then, fear had taken hold in Judith's household. She and her older sons were reportedly terrified of Frank. In one alarming incident, Frank and Jason had a confrontation at the trailer on his family's farm in Pleasant View. During the altercation, Frank allegedly bit the boy on the back and held a gun to his head. According to testimony, he then forced Judith and her sons to leave and warned her that if she tried to take the car, the twins, or contact law enforcement, he would kill her. Things escalated further in August 1989, just weeks before the murders. When Judith returned to the trailer to collect some of her belongings, Frank reportedly tied her up, sexually assaulted her, dragged a knife across her throat, and threatened her life. By the time of the killings, warrants had been issued against Frank, charging him with aggravated assault in connection to these incidents. That summer, Judith began receiving disturbing phone calls while working at a local Waffle House. A co-worker later testified that she had heard Frank's voice on the other end of those calls, delivering threats and chilling ultimatums. He allegedly vowed to shoot and stab Judith, and at one point even threatened the lives of Chad and Jason, claiming Judith treated them better than his own children. In the weeks leading up to the murders, the threats only became more brazen. According to witnesses, Frank warned Judith's father during a child exchange. "You tell Judy I've been playing with her with kid gloves, but now the gloves are coming off." On another occasion, he reportedly said he would kill her if she ever left him. One of Frank's co-workers from the maintenance service company where he was employed would later confirm hearing similar statements, deepening the portrait of a man consumed by anger, control, and the unraveling of a relationship that had once been a family. As we continue to peel back the layers of this tragic story, one question remains. Was Oscar Franklin Smith a man wrongly accused, or was he a calculating killer whose rage destroyed the lives of those closest to him? As the investigation into the brutal killings of Judith Smith and her 2 sons deepened, disturbing allegations began to surface, claims that painted a chilling portrait of premeditation and intent. One of Frank Smith's co-workers at a corporation in La Vergne testified that during the early summer of 1988, Frank made a shocking proposition. He allegedly offered to kill the co-worker's wife if the co-worker, in turn, would murder Judy. Weeks later, Frank suggested they coordinate the killings so that each man would be out of town when the other committed the act, in an attempt to build an alibi. The plot was never carried out, but it was far from the last time Frank would speak of such plans. Just 1 month before the murders, another co-worker recalled Frank asking if he knew anyone who would be willing to kill his wife and stepsons. 2 weeks later, Frank followed up, offering $20,000 to have Judith, Chad, and Jason killed. He was explicit in one unsettling detail. His twin sons were not to be harmed. When police first arrived at the crime scene, they discovered a key piece of physical evidence, a bloody palm print left on the sheet next to Judith's body. A fingerprint examiner later testified that it matched Frank's left palm. Notably, both the print and Frank's left hand were missing the 2 middle fingers, making it a highly distinctive match. Further circumstantial evidence continued to link Frank to the crime. A brown cotton work glove,
consistent with the kind Frank regularly used, was discovered in the front bedroom. He also owned a .22 caliber revolver, matching the caliber of bullets found in the victims, and was known to carry a large knife. His hobby, leatherworking, often required the use of a specialized tool called an awl, a sharp, needle-like instrument that resembled one of the murder weapons used in the attacks. Financial motives began to emerge as well. In March 1989, Frank had taken out a life insurance policy through American General for $20,000 on Judith and $10,000 on each of the boys. 1 month earlier, in February, he secured a similar policy with Liberty National. Again, $20,000 on Judith, with $5,000 on each son. An earlier policy with United Insurance insured Judith for $10,000 and the boys for $4,000 each. In total, Frank stood to collect nearly $88,000 in life insurance payouts, a potential financial windfall tied directly to their deaths. Frank testified that on October 1st, 1989, the day of the murders, he spent much of the day with Judith, Chad, Jason, and the twins. He claimed they met for breakfast at Shoney's in Nashville, then went back to Judith's home on Ludi Street, while Chad and Jason babysat the twins. Frank said he and Judith looked for a used car. That afternoon they had coffee at a Waffle House on Charlotte Avenue, then dinner at the Gold Rush restaurant. Later they returned to another Waffle House on Harding Place, where they stayed until about 9:30 p.m. Frank told authorities that they arrived back at Ludi Street shortly afterward. He said Chad and Jason helped carry the twins out to his car, and then he drove the twins 31 miles to his home in Pleasant View. Around 10:30 p.m., Judith called her sister to confirm that Frank had taken the twins for the night so she could continue searching for a car the next day. But that alibi would soon come into question. The son-in-law of a neighbor living just 2 doors down from Judith at 318 Ludi Street testified that he saw Frank's white LTD parked outside Judith's house between 11 p.m. and 11:15 p.m., shortly before the estimated time of the murders. Adding to the suspicion, Frank had asked his employer, where he worked as a machine tool repairman, for special permission to leave a day early for a work assignment in Moorhead, Kentucky. Instead of departing Monday morning as instructed, Frank requested to leave on Sunday, supposedly to get a head start. During the early morning hours of Monday, October 2nd, Frank made the 260 to 300-mile drive to Moorhead in his white LTD, completed a repair at the customer's plant, and returned to Pleasant View that afternoon. When law enforcement officers picked up Frank Smith for questioning on the evening of October 2nd, 1989, they immediately noticed something odd. He never asked why he was being detained. Even more disturbing, before being informed that his wife and stepsons were dead, Frank referred to Judy in the past tense. During the interview, Frank recounted that he had spent the previous Sunday with Judy looking for a car. He told officers they were reconciling and trying to rebuild their relationship. According to him, he left Nashville with their twin boys around 9 or 9:30 p.m., arrived at his mother's house by 10 or 10:30 p.m., and then departed shortly thereafter for a business trip to Moorhead, Kentucky. But when the officers informed Frank of the tragic murders, he showed little reaction. He asked no questions about how Judy, Chad, and Jason had died. The officers also noted physical injuries on Frank, abrasions on his hand, elbow, back, and shoulder blade. Frank dismissed them, claiming his dog had jumped on him when he returned home Monday afternoon. At trial, Frank mounted an alibi defense, relying on his own testimony and that of several family members. He claimed that from 10 p.m. to 11:15 p.m., he was at his Pleasant View home, and then drove directly to Kentucky. He adamantly denied the murders, as well as any history of violence toward Judy or the boys. Frank also denied owning a .22 caliber revolver, a large knife, or the leatherworking tool known as an awl, any of which could have been used in the attacks. He insisted he never attempted to hire anyone to commit murder, and claimed that the bloody palm print, identified by experts as his, and notable for being missing 2 middle fingers, just like his own hand, had been planted or was otherwise unexplainable. Frank also denied being at Judy's home at 11:22 p.m., a time corroborated by a neighbor's eyewitness account, but the state laid out a different narrative. Prosecutors argued that Frank planned the homicides, strategically left the twins with his mother around 10:30 p.m., then made the 30-minute return drive to Judy's home, where he committed the brutal killings before heading to Moorhead, Kentucky. Ultimately, the jury rejected Frank's alibi. He was found guilty of 3 counts of premeditated first-degree murder. During sentencing, the state presented compelling evidence, crime scene photographs, autopsy results, and testimony from the assistant Davidson County medical examiner, all of which underscored the victim's suffering. The brutal nature of the crime left little doubt in jurors' minds. Frank's defense, meanwhile, presented character witnesses and attempted to paint a more sympathetic picture. Several former co-workers described him as a reliable employee. His mother and daughter testified about his emotional connection to his teenage son, who had severe special needs and relied heavily on Frank for support. The defense also brought up Frank's mental health history, including a nervous breakdown during a business trip to Utah and a hospitalization for depression in April 1983. A psychiatrist who treated Frank back then described signs of paranoia, hypervigilance, and a condition known as adjustment disorder. Later, in November 1989, clinical psychologist Dr. Gillian Blair evaluated Frank and diagnosed him with paranoid personality disorder, chronic depressive neurosis, and paranoid delusional disorder. She added that Frank came from a deeply dysfunctional family, noting that his father had been officially diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Despite these mitigating arguments, the overwhelming weight of the evidence proved damning. The crime was cold, calculated, and cruel, and the court found Frank Smith fully responsible. In rebuttal to Frank Smith's claims of mental illness, the state presented testimony from Dr. Leonard Morgan, a clinical psychologist from the D.D. Wallace Center. Dr. Morgan had evaluated Frank to determine his competency to stand trial, and concluded that while Frank did exhibit personality disorders, he was not mentally ill or delusional. In fact, Frank had explicitly told Dr. Morgan he did not want to use an insanity defense, not out of pride or denial, but because he believed it might hurt his chances of obtaining a home loan in the future. On July 26, 1990, a Davidson County jury handed down a decision that would forever alter Frank Smith's life. He was sentenced to death, the result of a high-profile case that gripped the public with its disturbing details and emotional complexity. Over the years, as Smith sat on death row, his case experienced numerous delays and legal twists. One of the most significant interruptions occurred in 2020, when the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic halted much of the U.S. judicial system. Smith's scheduled execution in June 2020 was postponed, as were many others across the country, due to public health concerns and the logistical chaos brought on by the global crisis. Another tentative execution date was set for February 2021, but the continued effects of the pandemic again forced a delay. The legal landscape was left uncertain, overwhelmed by a backlog of cases and a shifting approach to justice in a world increasingly reconsidering capital punishment. Eventually, after years of appeals and emotional strain, Frank Smith's execution was rescheduled for April 21st, 2022. That date marked the culmination of more than 2 decades of court battles, advocacy, and legal maneuvering. In March 2022, Smith's legal team from the renowned Baker Botts law firm filed a clemency petition with Tennessee Governor Bill Lee. The petition emphasized Smith's mental health history, his background, and the complex circumstances of the crime. They also pointed to evidence of rehabilitation and called on the governor to weigh not only the law, but also the human cost of execution and the potential for redemption. At the same time, Frank Smith filed a motion to reopen his case, citing newly discovered DNA evidence. According to his public defender, Amy D. Harwell, DNA found on the murder weapon, believed to be an awl, did not match Frank, but rather an unknown individual. Additionally, a fingerprint from a crime scene investigator was found on the weapon, further complicating the case. Smith argued that he could not have presented this evidence earlier, as the technology used to analyze it was not available at the time of trial. Despite these efforts, on April 11th, 2022, a Tennessee court declined to reopen the case. Days later, on April 14th, Smith petitioned the Tennessee Supreme Court to vacate his execution date, but was again denied on April 18th. On April 19th, Governor Lee announced that he would not intervene in the execution. Then, in an unexpected twist, just 2 days before the scheduled execution, on April 21st, 2022, Governor Lee issued a temporary reprieve. The reason? An oversight in the preparation of the lethal injection. According to the governor, the chemicals used for the execution had only been tested for potency and sterility, not for endotoxins, which can cause serious health complications even in an execution setting. As a result, Lee suspended all executions in the state for the remainder of the year and ordered an independent third-party review of Tennessee's lethal injection protocol. On May 2nd, 2022, the governor confirmed that proper procedures had not been followed. This revelation sparked wider scrutiny over the state's capital punishment practices. Now, after extensive delays and continued controversy, a new death warrant has been issued. Frank Smith's execution has been rescheduled for May 22nd, 2025. If you found this case compelling and want us to continue shining light on the darkest corners of justice and crime, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive. On May 15th, 2025,
but the
at
roadblock
Florida
doesn't
State
stop
Prison,
Glen Rogers.
after spending more
2
than
minutes
2
later,
decades
though,
on death
other
row,
troopers
Glen
do
Edward
by ramming
Rogers
his
was
car,
executed by
forcing
lethal
him off the
injection
road,
in Florida.
dragging him
His
out
case
moments later
marked the
at
end of a
gunpoint.
long and haunting chapter in American criminal justice. Glen Edward Rogers, born in 1962, Rogers earned a notorious reputation during the 1990s, when a cross-country killing spree ultimately led to his conviction and death sentences in both
Channel
Florida
9
and
videographer
California.
Chick Poppy
But that's
asking
only
him
part
the
of
question
the story.
on everyone's
the media
mind
dubbed
tonight.
him the Casanova Killer, a reference to the infamous Venetian lover from the 1700s, known for his charm and conquests. And like the original Casanova, Rogers had a way with women, using his good looks, confidence, and flashy spending to draw them in. But behind the charm was a predator. While officially convicted of 2 murders, Rogers claimed responsibility for as many as 70 killings.
Moments
across
later,
the
as he was
United
transferred
States.
to another
Among those
trooper's car,
confessions was
I
an
asked an
explosive
angry
claim
Glen Rogers
that he,
the same
not
question
O.J.
again.
Simpson, was responsible for the 1994 murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. In one version of his story, Rogers said he had been romantically fixated on Nicole, but after she rejected him, he retaliated with violence. In another, he claimed he was hired by O.J. Simpson to break into her home and recover jewelry. only killing her and Goldman when they unexpectedly appeared. Authorities, however, dismissed these confessions, standing by their original findings and charges against Simpson. Still, what is undeniable is the terror Rogers inflicted in a short span of time. Between September and November of 1995, he murdered 4 women in 4 different
dragging
states,
him out moments
all
later
within
at
just
gunpoint.
6 weeks. He was cunning, but not exactly discreet. Rogers often used his real name when checking into motels. He even drove his victims' cars around for weeks after their deaths. His casual attitude made him harder to track, not because he was in hiding, but because he moved so freely and brazenly that few suspected the danger he posed. How did he slip through the cracks? What drove him to kill? And how many lives did he really take? In the fall of 1995, Glen Rogers' trail of terror moved west to the Van Nuys area of Los Angeles. That's where he met Sandra Gallagher, a married mother of 3 who was going through a rocky separation from her husband. Seeking a break from her troubles, Sandra went out for drinks with friends. That night, she crossed paths with Rogers. Charming and generous, he paid for Sandra's drinks and her friends, quickly winning her trust. By the end of the night, Rogers told Sandra he needed a ride home. She agreed, and they left together in her blue pickup truck. It was the last time she'd be seen alive. The next morning, hospital staff in the area noticed smoke rising from a nearby parking lot. A witness arriving early for her shift spotted a man with long blonde hair and a beard dousing the blue pickup truck in flames before fleeing on foot. Once the fire was extinguished, the horror became clear. Sandra's lifeless, badly burned body was discovered inside, but the fire hadn't killed her. The coroner later confirmed what investigators feared. She had been strangled to death before the flames ever touched her. Tracing Sandra's final hours, detectives went to the bar she'd visited the night before. Staff there remembered the man vividly. He'd been a regular over the past few days and introduced himself as Glen Rogers. When police searched Rogers' nearby apartment, they found personal items belonging to Sandra Gallagher. His name was immediately added to a nationwide wanted database, but by then, Glen Rogers had already vanished, and he wasn't done. Just weeks later, over 2,000 miles away in Jackson, Mississippi, Rogers resurfaced at the Mississippi State Fair, where he found work and met 34-year-old Linda Price, a single mother of 2. Their whirlwind relationship escalated quickly. With nowhere to stay, Rogers moved into Linda's apartment. At first, things seemed normal, but Linda soon noticed red flags. Rogers had a violent temper that only worsened with alcohol. Concerned for her safety, she confided in her family that she planned to ask him to leave. That conversation would be her last warning. On October 31st, 1995, Halloween night, Linda's family arrived at her home for a planned gathering. What they found instead was a nightmare. Linda had been stabbed to death and left in her bathtub. When detectives questioned the family, they all pointed to the same man, Glen Rogers. They knew him by name, and they knew Linda had planned to remove him from her life. When his name was entered into law enforcement databases, investigators discovered what they feared. Glen Rogers was already wanted for murder in California. Now, with a second woman dead and a cross-country fugitive on the loose, the manhunt for Glen Rogers was no longer a local search. It had become a national emergency. Just 5 days after the brutal murder in Van Nuys, California, Glen Rogers resurfaced, this time in Tampa, Florida. It was at a local bar that Rogers met 34-year-old Tina Marie Gibbs. The two shared drinks and casual conversation, and by the end of the evening, Rogers asked Tina for a ride back to his motel. She agreed. Tina drove a white Ford Festiva. The following morning, something odd happened. Rogers walked into the motel office and paid for an extra night, but soon after, the motel manager saw him loading his bags into Tina's white car and driving away. The scene felt off. Why pay for another night if he planned to leave? Rogers had also made a strange request. He didn't want anyone entering his room, not even housekeeping. But when checkout time came, and the Do Not Disturb sign was still hanging on the door, motel staff grew suspicious. Following protocol, a maid entered the room to clean. Inside the bathroom, she made a horrifying discovery. Tina Marie Gibbs was found lifeless in the bathtub. She had been stabbed to death. Investigators quickly tied the room rental to Glen Rogers. His pattern was becoming disturbingly clear. Charm, lure, kill, and then vanish. Detectives also noted a chilling detail. Rogers' victims often turned up in bathtubs. Authorities theorized he may have used running water in an attempt to wash away forensic evidence, his own twisted version of a cover-up. By now, the FBI had joined the hunt. Rogers was officially listed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives, and his name spread like wildfire through national headlines. But Rogers wasn't done. After fleeing Florida, he traveled to Bossier City, Louisiana, where he reunited with a woman named Andy Giles Sutton. One report suggests they may have known each other previously. Andy had told friends she was happy to see him again. Glen Rogers didn't stay hidden for long. Just days after the murder of Tina Marie Gibbs in Florida, Rogers resurfaced in Bossier City, Louisiana, where he reconnected with Andy Giles Sutton, a woman he may have known from the past. Andy had told her friends how happy she was to see him again, but that joy would turn to tragedy. Late one night, Andy's roommate came home and heard the couple in their shared bedroom. Rather than disturb them, she decided to sleep on the couch. The next morning, after hearing nothing from the room, she knocked gently on the door. There was no answer. She opened it and made a horrifying discovery. Andy was lying on the bed, brutally slashed and lifeless. When investigators questioned the roommate, she identified Andy's new boyfriend by name, Glen Rogers. By this point, the manhunt for Rogers had become national. The FBI had zeroed in on Kentucky, suspecting he might attempt to contact family there. They were right. 4 days after Andy's murder, a family member in Kentucky dialed 911. Rogers had just visited her home, she said, and she provided police with the direction he was headed, along with the vehicle description, a small white car, which authorities knew had belonged to Tina Marie Gibbs. Soon after, a Kentucky State Police trooper spotted the car. A high-speed chase ensued. Rogers lost control and crashed into a ditch. It was over. News crews, tipped off to the pursuit, arrived just in time to broadcast the dramatic arrest live. Inside the car, crime scene technicians recovered bloody clothing and evidence linking Rogers to all 4 murders committed during his 6-week cross-country rampage. The states involved agreed that Florida would try Rogers first. 2 years after his arrest, Glen Rogers stood trial for the murder of Tina Marie Gibbs. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Today, he remains on Florida's death row, with his execution scheduled for May 15th of this year. Following his Florida conviction, Rogers was temporarily transferred to California, where he was tried and convicted for the murder of Sandra Gallagher. There, too, he received another death sentence before being returned to Florida's death row. Other states declined to prosecute Rogers for the additional murders, since he had already received 2 death sentences. At least one report stated that Glen Rogers left behind 11 children without their mothers, a haunting reminder of the devastation left in his wake. On May 20th, 2025, Texas is set to carry out the execution of Matthew Lee Johnson, exactly 13 years to the day after the brutal crime that led to his death sentence. Whether by coincidence or intent, it's not the first time a death row inmate has faced execution on the anniversary of their crime, and it's happening twice this year. But today, our focus shifts to Texas, and to the final chapter in the case of Matthew Johnson. Johnson's trial took place in December 2013, roughly 18 months after his arrest. Since then, he's spent over a decade on death row, a relatively short wait compared to many. But the path to his conviction began with a single, devastating act. It was Sunday, May 20th, 2012, just before 7 a.m., when 76-year-old Nancy Harris arrived to open the convenience store where she'd worked faithfully for 12 years. By all accounts, Nancy was a kind, reliable soul who rarely missed a shift, except on rare occasions to catch a Dallas Cowboys game. Moments after she unlocked the doors, Matthew Johnson walked in, carrying a container of lighter fluid. According to statements he later gave authorities, he'd spent the night using cocaine and was desperate to fund his next hit. He had no gun, no knife, but what he did have would prove just as deadly. Inside the store, Johnson doused Nancy Harris in lighter fluid, an act that left her visibly shaken and terrified. He then robbed the store and fled. Nancy suffered severe injuries from what followed, details that are harrowing but essential to the case, and she later died from her wounds. As we reflect on this tragedy, one unsettling pattern emerges. The vulnerability of convenience store clerks is one of the most dangerous in America, particularly for those working the early hours or night shifts. Some safety measures have improved over the decades, like the addition of bulletproof glass enclosures, but for many, help still comes too late. This case, like so many others, leaves us with the same chilling truth. A hard-working, innocent person lost their life in the face of someone else's desperation and addiction. As the state of Texas prepares for Matthew Johnson's execution, we remember Nancy Harris not for how her life ended, but for the quiet strength she showed every morning she opened that store. She was someone's mother, grandmother, neighbor, a woman who worked hard and lived humbly until the very end. As Nancy Harris struggled to open the cash register, Matthew Johnson continued his rampage, grabbing several cigarette lighters from the counter and cartons of cigarettes from the shelves. Then, in a chilling moment of cruelty, he removed Nancy's wedding ring, a personal and heartbreaking theft that added insult to injury. Once he secured the money, surveillance footage captured what happened next. Just out of the camera's view, a sudden burst of flames lit up the screen. Seconds later, Nancy reappeared, engulfed in fire. She ran desperately toward the sink, splashing water on herself in a frantic attempt to put out the flames. Meanwhile, Johnson could be seen walking calmly out of the store, but just before stepping outside, he reached over to a candy rack, grabbed a handful of candy, and casually stuffed it into his pocket, as if what had just occurred behind him was nothing more than an ordinary errand. Back inside, Nancy fought to survive. She tried extinguishing the fire with water, tearing at the burning clothes on her body, but it wasn't enough. In one final agonizing effort, she ran from the store, her body still ablaze, screaming for help. By sheer chance, two Garland, Texas police officers, Billy Coffey and Anthony Simon, happened to be nearby. Stunned by the horrific scene unfolding in front of them, they rushed in with a fire extinguisher, working quickly to put out the flames and save Nancy's life. She was still conscious when paramedics arrived. In excruciating pain, Nancy described her attacker in detail, recounting everything that had happened inside the store. Her clarity and bravery in those final moments would prove crucial to the case. Nancy Harris fought to live, but tragically, 5 days later, she succumbed to her injuries at Parkland Hospital. The surveillance footage was clear. Johnson made no effort to disguise himself, and thanks to a tip from a neighbor following a nearby altercation, police found him later that same day. After a brief foot chase, officers arrested Johnson. He was still carrying Nancy's wedding ring. When Nancy passed away, the charge was upgraded to capital murder. In May 2012, Matthew Lee Johnson committed a crime that would ultimately cost him his life. But what makes this case even more haunting is the fact that Johnson had only recently re-entered society. Just 3 years earlier, he'd been released from prison after serving a 5-year sentence for robbery and other charges. Sadly, his time on the outside ended in tragedy. The evidence presented at Johnson's trial was overwhelming. Surveillance footage captured nearly every moment of the attack, and DNA evidence further sealed the prosecution's case. His defense team struggled to mount a viable argument beyond pointing to his long history of alcoholism and drug abuse, hoping to elicit even a sliver of compassion from the jury. During the punishment phase, Johnson took the stand, facing the court and members of Nancy Harris's grieving family. He said, "I'm sorry. I ask for y'all's forgiveness. I ask for mercy, not for the sake of me, but for the sake of my children and my wife." But the weight of his actions proved too great for mercy. Nancy Harris lived a full and selfless life before it was cut short. Born in Alaska in 1936, she married in 1960 and later settled in Texas. She became a widow in 1987 but continued forward, building a life rooted in work, family, and faith. She had 3 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren, and for over a decade, she greeted customers each morning at the gas station where she worked, known and loved by all who crossed her path. Local reporters who spoke with regulars at the store said it was unanimous. Nancy was admired and deeply respected. She wasn't just a clerk. She was a warm smile, a kind word, and a familiar face in the community. As we look at this case, it's easy to focus on the horror of the crime, but beneath it lies a deeper societal issue. Time and time again, these stories are fueled by addiction, a force that wrecks lives and leaves devastation in its wake. And yet too often, that same addiction is used in courtrooms as an excuse, a plea for leniency. But does it truly justify the irreversible pain left behind? Nancy Harris deserved better. Her family deserved better. And her community lost a woman who, by every account, made the world a little brighter. If you found this case as powerful as we did, be sure to subscribe for more in-depth coverage of death row stories and upcoming executions. We release new cases regularly, and we're committed to telling these stories with the dignity and truth they deserve.